as paradoxical as it may sound, the airplane is considered the safest means of transportation. Statistics show that even car accidents cause far more injuries and deaths than air travel. Nevertheless, as safe and reliable as modern aircraft may be, some of them still crash. But there's one thing airplanes cannot do: disappear without a trace. Or can they? On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, bound for Beijing, China. Flight MH370 was a regular daily service operated by Malaysia Airlines. On board were more than 200 passengers and crew members. 30 minutes after takeoff, the captain made his final radio contact with air traffic control. 40 minutes later, the Boeing didn't just vanish from radar. It disappeared completely, along with everyone on board. This incident became one of the greatest mysteries in modern aviation history. The investigation and search involved multiple countries, spanned years, and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet to this day, no one, from official authorities to scientists and conspiracy theorists, has been able to answer the question, what happened to flight MH370? You don't need to be a genius to understand that a huge modern passenger jet cannot simply vanish without a trace. Advanced onboard systems, ground-based radar, and orbiting satellites are all designed to meticulously track an aircraft's entire journey and pinpoint its location at any given moment. Yet, in the case of flight MH370, none of these systems worked as intended. So, on the night of March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777 was preparing for its routine, daily flight to Beijing. The scheduled flight time was 5.5 hours. Weather conditions were normal, and only a couple of minor turbulence zones were expected en route. The aircraft was commanded by Zahari Ahmad Shah, a highly experienced 53-year-old pilot with over 30 years of flying experience with Malaysian carriers. The first officer was Farik Abdul Hamid, a 27-year-old pilot with just 4 years of experience. In addition to the two pilots, there were 10 other crew members, each with between 10 and 30 years of experience. On board were 227 passengers from various countries, though the majority were Chinese citizens. Prior to takeoff, the Boeing 777 was, of course, refueled. The amount of fuel on board was sufficient for 7.5 hours of flight, 2 hours more than required. At 0:40, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah received clearance for takeoff, and just 20 minutes later, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of approximately 10.5 kilometers. The takeoff proceeded as planned, and the plane remained clearly visible on all radar systems. But just 7 minutes later, strange things began to happen. First, the captain contacted ground control again and repeated his earlier message about reaching cruising altitude, word for word, the exact same message. Immediately after that transmission, flight MH370, while over the South China Sea, exited Malaysian airspace and entered Thai airspace. The air traffic controller instructed the captain to contact Vietnamese air traffic control. This was the last communication. Zahari never responded. Even more troubling, the aircraft disappeared from radar immediately after this transmission. Of course, the first assumption when a plane disappears from radar is that it has crashed. However, as later investigations revealed, flight MH370 remained airborne for many more hours. On the ground, the disappearance wasn't noticed immediately. The controller was apparently distracted by other aircraft. When he finally realized that MH370 was missing, he assumed the plane had simply left his coverage area and entered Vietnamese airspace. Vietnamese controllers, in turn, observed MH370 entering their airspace and then vanishing. According to regulations, they were supposed to notify Kuala Lumpur within 5 minutes if the pilot failed to establish contact. However, the Vietnamese did not do so. Instead, they attempted to contact the crew themselves. Only after nearly 30 minutes of unsuccessful attempts did they inform their Malaysian counterparts. The Malaysians responded that everything was fine. The aircraft was on course, flying over Cambodia, and had not disappeared. Curiously, Malaysia Airlines made this statement based on the flight plan, not on radar data. Due to this lapse in attention, aviation authorities were not officially alerted to the missing aircraft within the required 1-hour window. In fact, Another 4 hours passed with no action. Only when flight MH370 failed to land in Beijing at the scheduled time did everyone realize something terrible had happened. The plane was immediately declared missing, and search efforts were launched primarily in the South China Sea, under the assumption that it had crashed. Dozens of vessels from Malaysia and Vietnam scoured the sea, but no wreckage was found. It wasn't until several days after the disappearance, thanks to radar data from various sources, that investigators realized flight MH370 had made a sharp, nearly 180-degree turn, crossed Malaysian territory, skirted Indonesia, and then made a sharp turn south. After this maneuver, the plane continued flying for several more hours before vanishing completely from all radar. Its flight path was clearly not random, nor could it be explained by a technical failure. Everything pointed to a well-thought-out plan. But who devised it? For what purpose? And where, ultimately, did the plane with 200 people on board end up? Malaysian authorities, especially after discovering the plane hadn't crashed in the South China Sea, were completely baffled. Help came from Inmarsat, a London-based company specializing in commercial satellite communications. Although commercial aviation wasn't their primary focus, their satellite data could help reconstruct almost the entire flight path of MH370, thus ruling out some theories of its disappearance. The entire journey of the missing aircraft can be divided into two parts. The first part was known thanks to civilian and military radar. The second part was reconstructed using data from Inmarsat satellites. It was clear that something abnormal had occurred on board. Systems that transmit data to the ground, such as transponders, had been disabled. But they didn't shut off suddenly, as would be expected in the case of a fire or explosion. The transponders were turned off gradually and manually, meaning from the cockpit. Moreover, after the sharp turn, the entire remainder of the flight was conducted under manual control, as indicated by lateral oscillations in the flight path, something that would not occur with autopilot engaged. After MH370 disappeared from ground radar, satellite data showed it continued flying at high speed and high altitude for another 6 hours, heading toward Antarctica, before ultimately vanishing in the southern Indian Ocean. However, because this information emerged too late, the initial search efforts were focused in entirely the wrong areas, wasting precious time. When the search finally shifted to the Indian Ocean, where the plane was last detected, over $100 million was spent scanning the ocean floor. By some estimates, this became the most expensive and extensive search operation in history. In July 2015, 16 months after the disappearance, residents of Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean discovered part of a Boeing 777 wing. Serial numbers confirmed it was a piece of the missing aircraft. Later, a total of 20 Boeing 777 debris fragments were found along the coasts of Madagascar and other coastal regions. However, only a few were definitively identified as coming from flight MH370. The rest were only presumed to be from the same plane. In 2018, a massive 450-page investigation report was released. Its conclusion stated, "It is not possible to determine the true reasons for the aircraft's disappearance." To this day, the investigation into the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777 and the search for its remains have been suspended. Not a single body has been recovered, nor any new debris beyond those 20 fragments. Neither the families of the missing passengers nor the rest of the world knows the true cause of flight MH370's disappearance. Numerous theories have emerged about what happened, from pilot suicide to encounters with aliens or absorption by a microscopic black hole. Journalists, scientists, aviation experts, and conspiracy theorists have all offered their explanations. One theory echoes the findings of the 2018 official report. Some believe the aircraft was hijacked by terrorists who forced the pilots to land on an island in the Indian Ocean or a nearby country with a runway long enough to accommodate a Boeing 777. Another theory suggests terrorists remotely hacked into the aircraft's autopilot and took control of the flight systems, depriving the pilots of control. The idea of a hijacking by various forces is widespread. Among the alleged perpetrators are the US military, agents of North Korea, and 2 Iranians who purchased tickets using stolen passports, Luigi Maraldi of Italy and Christian Kozel of Austria. The men had lost their passports in Thailand, and although their data was entered into Interpol's international database of stolen documents, this did not prevent 18-year-old Puri Nurmohammadi Mehrdad and 29-year-old Syed Mohammed Reza Delavar from buying tickets under those names. However, investigators believe the two were likely ordinary refugees. Another theory claims the plane landed at a U.S. military base, after which, according to this theory, the passengers' bodies were loaded on board. Then the pilots supposedly took off, set the plane on autopilot, and parachuted out. The aircraft, it is alleged, continued flying and exploded over Ukraine's Donbass region on July 17, 2014, 4 months after its disappearance over the Indian Ocean. Other hypotheses include fire or explosion. Flight MH370 was carrying over 200 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries, which can ignite if overheated. However, the investigation concluded the cargo was transported according to regulations, so the fire theory has been ruled out. Moreover, this explanation fails to account for why the plane dramatically deviated from its course and flew for 7 hours with transponders disabled. One of the most frequently discussed theories is pilot suicide. Specifically, that Captain Shah deliberately downed the plane. Media reports claimed he was experiencing personal problems. Allegedly, on the day before the flight, his wife left him, taking their children. She was also rumored to have been having an affair. Researchers analyzed over 100 of Shah's interviews and found not a single mention of his plans after March 2014, leading some to conclude he no longer had any future plans. Additionally, media reports highlighted flight routes he had simulated in his personal flight simulator, one of which closely mirrored the final path of MH370. Another argument supporting the theory was that the plane was flying toward Penang, Shah's hometown. This theory remains one of the most prominent among unofficial explanations. Former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott supported it, claiming that the Malaysian government had leaned toward this theory from the very beginning at the highest levels. However, the pilot's family and relatives have repeatedly denied any connection to suicide. Perhaps a new search operation could shed light on the mystery if the black boxes are recovered. However, these recorders only store the last 2 hours of cockpit conversations. Older recordings are overwritten by new ones. Therefore, even if the flight recorders are found, they would only provide technical flight data and audio from the final 2 hours before impact. Everything that happened in the first minutes after MH370 turned off its transponders and deviated from its route will likely remain a mystery forever.